I think that the church in every age faces its own challenges. It's the whole question then of relevance. The constant challenge of the church being in the world but not of the world. Um, and there's a sense in which the church then has to be relevant, but at the same time the church also has to maintain a critical prophetic distance. And that's an ongoing challenge. It's certainly true of the African church. Again, it's a bit dangerous to speak of the African church in general. But yes, there are challenges that the church faces. One of those challenges clearly is the health and wealth gospel, which has its certain strengths to it, but it has its own weaknesses. Interestingly, I would say that even the challenge of the health and wealth gospel reflects perhaps a deeper challenge of an uncritical importation of theologies and practices from the West. There are particular Western streams of the church popularized through the TV and media that have pervaded that health and wealth gospel, and unfortunately some aspects, some sections of the church on the continent have inherited that sort of lock, stock and barrel, which perhaps is not very different from other forms of church and theologies that the African church has received in the past. So yes, there is that dimension to that. But there are other challenges that the church faces. The challenge of development and nation building, the challenge of leadership in our given context, and how does the church then speak to those sorts of issues. The challenges of living in an increasingly multicultural context. There's a sense in which the church on the continent has always existed in a pluralistic context. But increasingly, as for example now in Kenya trying to draft a new constitution, what then does that mean? How do you bring a Christian voice to speak into those issues? There's a challenge of corruption. So that people have rightly said, well, if the church is growing on the continent, then why is corruption also rampant? There's a sense in which perhaps one would argue the issue there is not simply corruption, it's the question of what is a Christian view of society? How do you build a just society? And how does the church then begin to engage those issues of sociocultural development and ethics and morality? So these are issues we have to contend with on the continent. One of the things we're doing at NEXT is through our Institute for the Study of African Realities, we're trying to develop different centers that will address some of those specific issues. For example, we have recruited someone to head a center for peace building and reconciliation. We want to develop a center for law, ethics and governance that will then interact with some of the socio-economic, ethical leadership issues that are there. So yes, there are a number of those challenges that the church has to engage with in terms of being a Christian voice and being a Christian conscience, but also a Christian understanding of not only what the church itself is, but what will be a Christian view of society and the social vision.